Webinar attendees are muted and cameras are turned off. To ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. This session will run from 2:15 to 3:15 Eastern and includes a Q&A period. We will save all questions until the end of the session, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout the talk. Please remember that the Code of Conduct is in effect during the duration of the summit. The Research Data Access and Preservation Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There is a Code of Conduct helper available during the session. Tess is identified as the Code of Conduct helper, both in Feedloop and here in Zoom, and you may direct any messages to them if you need assistance. They can provide you with the Code of Conduct email address or the link to the incident report form if needed. And with that, I'd like to welcome our final keynote speaker. Dr. Casey Fiesler is an associate professor of information science and computer science by courtesy at University of Colorado Boulder. She researches and teaches in the areas of technology ethics, internet law and policy, and online communities. Her work on research ethics for data science, ethics, education and computing, and broadening participation in computing has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and she is the recipient of an NSF Career Award. Also a public scholar, she is a frequent commentator and speaker on topics of technology ethics and policy, and her research has been covered everywhere from the New York Times to Teen Vogue, though she is particularly proud of her TikToks. She holds a PhD in human-centered computing and a JD from Vanderbilt Law School. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Fiesler to begin her talk.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to this particular audience. I was a little unsure initially of how appropriate this topic is, but on the other hand, I think this is a really interesting topic for everyone, but particularly anyone who is interested in data. So the title of this talk is When Data is People, which hopefully will make a lot of sense by the end of this. So I imagine that many of you have seen headlines that look like this lately. This is not a particularly new kind of issue. How our social media data might be used in various types of contexts, but we've certainly been hearing a lot more about it thanks to generative AI. I have been playing with large language models a fair amount over the past few years, being an ethicist. And one of the things that I did before a recent talk was ask ChatGPT to provide a series of tweets written by me, focusing on topics that I often talk about. I will say that both of these examples here, let's innovate ethically, sparkles, and me tearing up at a student email. These are both a little silly, but not completely outside the realm of possibility. I also asked for an example of a sort of intro-y blue sky post for me. This one's not bad, except for some reason, large language models consistently think that I have a cat. I understand why they might think that I have a cat, but this is an excellent example of misinformation. I have a dog. But a question that I'm assuming that many of you know the answer to already is how could ChatGPT possibly know what Casey tweets like? And we know that the training data for these large language models come from as vaguely described by Meta, for example, at some point, a mix of publicly available online data. Now, data being publicly available is a phrase that we have heard many times before. Some of you may be familiar with this example from 2016, where a researcher spoofed a logged-in user and scraped all of OkCupid, the dating site, and released a public data set with no anonymization or data cleaning at all. Just here is all of OkCupid. Now, some of you may have been on OkCupid and know how it works. The way that their matching algorithm works is that they have you answer a series of highly personal questions and use these for their matching algorithm. So let's just say that it would be unsurprising if people could be re-identified from this data, and also unsurprising if a lot of people would be unhappy about having their answers to highly personal questions tied to their identity. And at the time, when the researcher was called out on this, he said the data is already public. That's a common ethical heuristic for this kind of thing. In fact, so common that my collaborator, Michael Zimmer, has been writing about this exact turn of phrase since 2010. He actually has a Google alert for the data is already public that pops up sometimes. And of course, over the years, we've seen many headlines around uses of public data for research purposes, often with people being surprised to find out that this is something that's happening. I am presenting this in a value neutral way. Maybe not the OkCupid example. I was not very value neutral about that, but the idea of using public social media data for research in general. Of course, we have many research topics that we have been able to study using publicly available data, everything from public health trends predicting where the flu is going, for example, to mental health discussions on Reddit. I have used public data in my research myself. One example is I wanted to know how people felt about research ethics controversies. And I analyzed comments on news articles as a data source. Now, perhaps not today, but in the past, a particularly common data source was Twitter. And in fact, Twitter was such a common data source that in 2014, Zeynep Tufekci, in a paper about pitfalls for social media data in research, talked about Twitter as having the model organism problem. She compared Twitter to the fruit fly. Now, fruit flies, as you may know, are very commonly studied, particularly in genetics, and that's not because the fruit fly is like the best thing to study. It's not like fruit flies are like the most genetically similar to other organisms or anything like that. Fruit flies are studied because they're easy to study, because they have short lifespans, they're easy to keep alive, and there's just lots of reasons that have to do with how easy they are to study. The same was true with Twitter in 2014. The easily available API for collecting Twitter data meant that it was one of the just like easiest to get data sources, and there was so much there. We used Twitter to study everything. And so near in the beginning of my faculty career, and oh my gosh, 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, we were having a bit of a research ethics renaissance in the sort of social computing community, in part, frankly, because of the Facebook emotional contagion study. But we, everyone had been relying on thinking about research ethics through IRBs and compliance ethics boards for so long that we were starting finally to have a lot of conversations about research ethics around publicly available data. And myself and my collaborator, Nick Proferis, decided to ask what today seems like a pretty simple question, but at the time was fairly novel. How do Twitter users feel about this? So we conducted a survey, and if you are thinking, gosh, didn't the survey have a lot of selection bias? Survey to research people about how they feel about research? The answer is yes, it probably did. And we were so worried about this that we thought there was like a 50-50 chance that we wouldn't even publish this work because we were going to get a bunch of answers that was like, yeah, research is awesome. But that was not what we found. And one thing that we found was that most of the people we surveyed, and this study was conducted in 2017, was that most people had no idea that this was a thing that even happens. And I will tell you anecdotally that having been talking to people about this for the past 10 years, this is accurate. Most people have never considered the fact that scientists might be reading their tweets. And often the reaction to this is like, why? Why would scientists be interested in my tweets? And of those, almost half also thought that, well, that can't be allowed. um, uh, we also asked people about a lot of different contextual factors. I'm about to show you a big table that I do not expect you to find any meaning out of as you look at this, though of course you can find a lot more detail in the paper. But the point I want you to get out of this big wall of table is that stuff matters. Contextual factors matter in terms of how comfortable people are with this practice. Things like, well, how many tweets were analyzed and how were they analyzed? And like, was a human reading them, or was it, was this just my public information? Was my private information? Were these, tweets that had been deleted? Are you quoting it in a paper? There were a lot of things that impacted how people felt about this practice. And we came to the conclusion that this is not, that these things all matter. The problem is that for a very, very long time, the ethical heuristic for is it okay to collect data is the data public? And if that is your only ethical heuristic, then it suggests that all of these things don't matter. Things like, what kind of data is it? And what are you going to do with it? If that's your sole ethical heuristic, it suggests that a tweet about what someone had for breakfast is equivalent and should be treated equivalently to a tweet revealing a sensitive medical condition. Now, of course, Twitter is in a very different spot today than it used to be. This has caused a lot of conversation in the academic community about where do we get data like this now. Again, there are a lot of really important things that you can do with social media data. Research around misinformation, research around public health, lots of kinds of things that are deeply important. There's been a lot of think pieces about this over the past couple of years. And interestingly, in this same article published in Science a couple of years ago, myself and also Dean Freelon at UNC made the same suggestion to the journalists, which was that I think we might see even more research on Reddit data. And I would actually argue, well, it's interesting. I made this slide along a couple of years ago, and I would say this is slightly less true today than it was when I spoke to that journalist. In part because Reddit is also has also made a lot of changes to the availability of Reddit data, but traditionally, this has also been a huge source of data for scientists studying all kinds of things. So myself and actually those same couple of collaborators I have already mentioned and some other folks did a systematic lit review a few years ago about what people are studying on Reddit. We read 700 papers about that use Reddit data. And one of the things that I think was very interesting from this, that you'll see from these charts here, is that a lot of the topics that are commonly studied on Reddit are topics that one might consider quite sensitive. Mental health, for example. There's a lot of mental health research happening on Reddit. Now, one of the things that we did, and this paper has a lot of detail about all kinds of things about what Reddit research looks like. One of the things we did was we labeled extremely generously, did this paper talk about research ethics at all? And when I say generously, I mean, if the paper said this data was public, so it was okay for us to collect, like we counted that. So out of these 700 papers, less than 150 of them said anything about ethics at all. The vast majority of them didn't say the data is public and it's okay. They didn't say we, even if they said we didn't talk to our IRB for this reason, we even counted that, or any discussion of, safeguards or anything like that. But we did analyze those 100 papers or so, looking at what people were talking about when they were talking about research ethics. And as a result, we got a lot of examples of practices that people are using to think ethically through how to use this particular type of public data. And this included things like, not just relying on compliance, like university IRBs, engaging with community gatekeepers, like moderators, taking particular types of care for vulnerable communities or sensitive topics, obfuscating data using types of ethical fabrication. For example, to make sure that if someone Googled the quote in your paper, it's not going to take them back to the original poster. Limiting access to data when appropriate, thinking about risk versus benefits, and also considering researcher positionality. And if you're interested in this and don't want to read the whole paper, I wrote a short blog post about this as well. And this becomes interesting as well when we consider that Reddit, even though they're decreasing access to their API, struck a deal with OpenAI. So Reddit posts are in training data more directly as well now. All of this comes down to, and this is sort of, my research ethics hill to die on, and I made this slide probably 10 years ago. That publicness isn't the only context that matters here. And in thinking about this as a result, in the time since we did that Twitter ethics survey, I also have been working with a series of graduate students in my lab on studies about specific populations and contexts for this. Because one of the things here is that it also matters what kind of community you're studying. And this was a quote from one of these studies talking about the researchers coming in, parachuting into this community, like without taking the time to understand it, just sort of looking around and leaving. So these are the populations that we've looked at, specifically fandom communities, queer people, Black Twitter, fat people, and people with chronic illnesses. These are all topics that that my graduate students have been interested in over the years. And one of the things that we've gotten at through this series of research is that, of course, there are a lot of contextual things that are really important to these different communities, but they all tie back to some of these things that should matter when you're making ethical decisions about collecting and using data. So, for example, when my former student Shamika spoke to participants on Black Twitter, one of them said, "I don't mind Black people reflecting and researching on these experiences because it's a shared experience and those voices need to be heard. But when it's a white person, it just comes off as colonization." It's interesting because we think a lot about positionality when it comes to human subjects research. Things like how's your rapport with your interview subjects. We don't talk about that as much when it comes to analysis of trace data. But one could argue that it's even more important here. I mean, imagine that you are studying a community that you're not a part of, that maybe you don't know a lot about, and you're not talking to them. Imagine collecting data from a community that you're not a part of and interpreting that data without ever even talking to someone from that community. These are things that can really make a big difference. Another thing that can matter is what your goals are. Why are you studying this particular community? Is it because you just think that it's something that could advance your career? One of our other interview participants mentioned, some researchers just hate fat people and want to paint them in a bad light. Like, of course, I'm not okay with that. And of course, there are a lot of reasons that we might do research. If you're thinking about benefits versus harms, I see a lot of research that uses public data where the stated motivation in the paper is yet another machine learning algorithm to predict X. And if X is something that required like very sensitive data or it is from a particularly vulnerable population, and there's no reason other than we wanted to see if we could, at that point I start to wonder. Another thing to think about is who you're benefiting. When one of my students talked to people who post content online about chronic illness, someone mentioned feeling like a lab rat. And also, they're just poking and prodding you, and then you don't ever find out what happened. What about engaging with the community that's being studied in a way that's more than just like, hey, thanks for the data? And actually, most of the time, you don't even say thanks for the data. Um, are the people that you're studying the same ones that you're benefiting is, I think, an interesting question to ask. And another finding from our Twitter study that I thought was interesting and maybe even a little surprising was that 80% of our participants said they'd want to know if their tweet was in a research study. One thing interesting here is that, informed consent doesn't always have to come together. You can always inform people without consenting them too. But also 83% of people said they want to read the paper. I would want to read a paper that one of my social media posts was in. Now, I will give this with a caveat that, of course, there are contexts in which you would not want to do this for various reasons. We should be keeping in mind researcher safety, for example. But in the case where there's no reason not to share the findings back with the community, I think that that's good practice. And the other thing, if you're thinking about who are you benefiting, you should also be thinking about who you're potentially harming. There was a controversy a few years ago about a researcher who was using YouTube videos of people who were going through gender transition in order to train facial recognition systems, in order to be able to like identify people if they were on HRT. This journalist from The Verge spoke to some of the people who were in this data set, who were not difficult to find. And they were surprised to find that they were in this data set. This person talks about it feeling like a violation of privacy, but also that they recognize the danger of this technology. So imagine that you are putting yourself in a vulnerable position by putting this information about yourself out there in order to help your people in your community. And then you find out that your content is being used to build a technology that could potentially harm that same community. And this kind of issue as well, like it's not even just like whether the content is sensitive, but also what kind of position is the person whose content that is, what kind of position are they in? When we talked to people in fandom, which was also a proxy for queer people in this context, one of the concerns that people had was how their fandom content might be revealed to a broader audience and how that could have the potential to out someone. So for example, say, you're a fan artist, you're posting on Tumblr, especially at the time we did these interviews, it was not uncommon for BuzzFeed to just have like here's some cool fan art kind of stories. So your fan art, which you had posted on Tumblr, to like hashtags for your small fandom, is now, seen by millions of people on BuzzFeed. Someone recognizes your art style and it takes them back to your Tumblr where you are out as queer when you're not out to that person. And so people talked about, even if I'm not posting things that are sensitive or dangerous, I'm in a vulnerable position if the things that I post online are revealed outside their intended audience. And interestingly, so I talk about fandom a fair amount, in part because this was my dissertation research was actually about fandom communities, particularly in the context of copyright, which will come up in in a moment now. So if you're not familiar with like transformative fandom, I'm talking about people who write fan fiction. So, the continuing adventures of Kirk and Spock, a community that exists because of like the ability to sort of like remix and reuse existing media. A lot of people thought it was kind of counterintuitive that a lot of people in the fandom community were actually quite upset about generative AI systems generative AI systems being trained on fan fiction. There was actually a huge controversy about this before ChatGPT was even released. Um, I actually did not find this reaction counterintuitive at all. And the reason was because thanks to my dissertation research, I'm very familiar with these social norms for around content and fandom. And there are a couple of very strong norms that using data without permission for generative AI systems strongly violate. And this is a quote from a study about fandom and safety and ethics and privacy. And one of the things that someone pointed out was like, fandom is not for you. And for you, I mean the public. Like, this is for a very specific set of people. It's written with a certain audience in mind. And yes, it's public. Um, but there's this unspoken agreement that this is stuff for fandom. Again, so people have this idea of appropriateness norms for content reuse in this community and sort of who it's for. Also, in some of my prior work on copyright, some of the norms that became extremely clear in this space were around attribution and around non-commercialism. So, one of the like commandments of fan fiction is don't sell your fan fiction. There are a lot of reasons for this that I could go into. But also like attributing the inspiration, right? Like fan fiction communities are like sometimes referred to as gift economies or like payment and credit. Like because you're not getting paid for this, like getting credit attribution for your work is incredibly important. And so people's fan fiction being used to train commercial AI systems without their consent, like just violates all of the sort of most important norms of the space. As a result, there's been a lot of backlash, including a bunch of fan fiction writers who decided to like basically try to poison ChatGPT by writing like intentionally bad fan fiction. A symbolic gesture, perhaps. But you may have also heard about something similar to this in artist communities. So there actually was a tool created to allow people to intentionally poison data sets, basically in a way that like sort of like applies incorrect labels implicitly to images that appear online. And a lot of the conversation about backlash against training data in the context of artists and authors and these kinds of things has been discussed in the context of copyright. I have another version of this talk that goes into more sort of like the copyright issues around generative AI. That's not what this talk is, but I will say that when we get to the Q&A period, should anyone want to talk to me about copyright of generative AI, I have a lot of thoughts. But one of those thoughts is that, frankly, copyright is not the interesting issue here. I mean, okay, it's interesting. It's legally interesting. It's sort of intellectually interesting. I am interested from a, expert on fair use perspective, where these court cases go. But I think that when it comes to the question of like, why are artists so upset, that it's not always copyright. And I think that if you're thinking about why is someone, upset that their art that they've been putting on, DeviantArt and Instagram and sharing with the world for the past decade and maybe making some money from it. Hoping that if I put enough art on Instagram, maybe someone will commission me to create the book cover for their self-published novel. Copyright, okay. But I think far more profound is my work is being used to build a technology that could replace me. To me, that is much more like ethically profound and important. That said, that's not a thing that you litigate in court, right? That's not a fair use question. This is an ethical conundrum. I think that that's really important. And of course, we've heard about this in other contexts as well. There was the writer's strike and the actor's strike. And in these cases, we know one of the things that comes up as well is like the use of people's likenesses without their consent, also a kind of data. And this question of like, what kind of data are you choosing to use? What are you doing with it? These kinds of questions. It's not always just about like, oh, I need to make money from it either. Another example that I saw a couple of years ago was a voice actress going into a Discord server where people were talking about the game that she's a voice actress in. She goes into this Discord server. Someone is using a voice clone to use her voice to read pornography in this Discord server, which of course was very upsetting. So again, I think that there's a lot of these sort of ethically profound questions when it comes to data that aren't always about these legal questions around copyright or even consent. Sometimes they're deeper than that. And one of the things that I think that came out of kind of thinking about all of these things together, and I have to tell you, I did not think that my research around copyright, 15 years ago, was particularly relevant to all of this research that I did around research ethics for public data until generative AI. And then I was like, oh, okay, actually, these things have a connection. Because I have spent a lot of time thinking about normative components of content reuse and data reuse, issues of non-commerciality, attribution, also privacy. If you're sharing content outside of its original context, where else can it go? Traceability. We often have no way of even knowing if our content has been used anywhere. If our face is in a facial recognition data set, for example, we might not even know. Compensation, labor protection, replacement market harm, and agency. Like, do we even have the ability to do anything about this? But one of the important things here is that this isn't a one size fits all kind of thing. This isn't a, well, is the data public? Yes or no kind of thing. So something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, having done all of this research over many years, are what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about as researchers. And when I say researchers, I mean, computer scientists, social scientists, and, people building AI systems and using training data. What are the norms and the expectations of the people represented by that data? One thing is that here's one very concrete example. When I was in graduate school, gosh, I don't even know if I can talk about Yik Yak anymore without having to explain it. Does anyone know what Yik Yak is? A geo constrained anonymous social media platform. It was very popular at Georgia Tech in 2014. We were thinking of studying it in my lab, and me being the buzzkill lawyer in the group read the terms of service, which very clearly said, do not collect data from Yik Yak. And so my PhD advisor asked the CEO of Yik Yak, because he'd given a talk at Georgia Tech or something, like, could we collect data? And they said no. Other people, meanwhile, wrote interesting papers about Yik Yak. We did not. But in retrospect, I think that was the correct decision, because the thing about Yik Yak was that users had an expectation that that data was not being archived. One of the things about Yik Yak was that your content disappeared after like a couple days. And so I think that was actually a very reasonable thing. Another question, of course, that you should be asking is, how could individuals or communities be harmed by the use of the data or by the dissemination of the data? There might be harms that are different, regarding whether or not you are archiving it somewhere, whether you're quoting something in a paper, or whether you're just analyzing it. Again, who is benefiting from this use? And are the people benefiting the same ones who are facing potential harms? Because that's not always the case. Also, is anyone benefiting besides you, the researcher? And then, of course, all of these things, what could you do to mitigate the potential for harm or increase the likelihood of benefits? Maybe that likelihood of benefits is sharing that research back with the community, or sharing it, beyond your dissertation document, or other academics. And then all of these things, can you answer these questions well enough to suggest that you're the right person to be conducting this research and doing this work? And if the answer to that question seems to be no, like, I can't answer these questions because I don't know enough about these people that I'm collecting data from, then that suggests maybe you should do something to change that. Maybe it means collaborators. Maybe it means spending some time in that community. Maybe it means talking to community gatekeepers. Maybe it means attempts to understand the potential harms more, so you can figure out how to mitigate them. Sometimes you need to do research before you do the research. And I think that this question becomes challenging as well. Other things that I have completely different talks on. I do a fair amount of work on ethical speculation, like how do we think about things that might go wrong. And one of the studies that I've done on this topic was around a teaching exercise that I use called the Black Mirror Writers' Room, where I'm having students pitch Black Mirror episodes as a way of thinking through unintended consequences of near future technology. And we interviewed instructors who've used this teaching exercise. And one of the thoughts from an instructor who had used this exercise that I thought was really important was that they were talking about both that teaching exercise and related speculative things like doing user personas. They pointed out how people, in this case students, tend to lean on their own experiences, and they don't, unless carefully prompted, consider broader context. So, if you're having students come up with like, how are people going to use this thing? Almost universally, people would be like, well, the user is a middle-class white person, and here's what they're going to do. The point that they were getting at here was that it's sometimes hard to think outside of our own experiences, and I think this is very true. I'm sure that many of you remember Zoom bombing as a one of the terrible things that happened at the height of the pandemic. At the time, there was a New York Times article where they interviewed the CEO of Zoom, and this was about Zoom bombing. And the CEO of Zoom said to this journalist, "The misuse, we didn't really think about that." And this, prompted a conversation about whether they should have known. I was thinking about this. I have no idea who was in the room when Zoom was making design decisions. But one thing is that if you think about who's really good at imagining how technology might be used to harass people, people who get harassed a lot, especially online. Women, people of color, queer people, are like, people who get harassed a lot online are really good at thinking about how people are going to use technology to harass them. I could have told you right away if you explained to me how the privacy features on Zoom worked, like, oh, people are going to type in random numbers and like go into Zoom rooms and yell racial slurs. Like this is, the kind of thing that people do. But, I just named off like groups of people who get harassed a lot. I'm also naming off groups of people who are underrepresented in tech. And I'm not saying that like more diversity in tech is going to save us, that like, this is going to solve all of our ethical problems. And also, frankly, it shouldn't be on the shoulders of like, people who are marginalized to solve all of our problems for us. But I do think that more voices to understand the harms of technology are incredibly important. And one of the things that I think is important in that context is that, even if I don't think I'm not one of those people who thinks that everyone needs to learn how to code, actually, even if we don't get more people in the room in tech, the more people who understand enough about technology to critique it, the better. And I think this is very important in the context of AI. Some of you might be familiar with Eliza, the chatbot from the 1960s. When after Joseph Weizenbaum made Eliza, one of the things that he noticed early on was that his assistant was very convinced that Eliza was a real person. He was struck by how easily this chatbot could fool people. But then, and this is in a paper that he wrote at the time, he said, these machines can behave in wondrous ways, often sufficient to dazzle even the most experienced observer. But once a particular program is unmasked and its inner workings are explained in language sufficiently plain to induce understanding, its magic crumbles away. And there it is. And he says, a mere collection of procedures. Now, I could explain to almost anyone how Eliza works, and it would make sense to you. I mean, Eliza was basically Mad Libs. It is very hard to explain to someone how ChatGPT works in language sort of plain enough that its inner workings, can be explained enough to sort of make the magic crumble away. But it's not impossible. And I think that this is something that's really important that we are doing, trying to do more to explain enough about how these technologies work so that people can understand their limitations and ethical implications. And this includes where the data is coming from and what the consequences of where that data is coming from are. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why I will be legitimately sad if TikTok goes away in 2 weeks. I've been using TikTok, also Instagram and some other places to try to teach people about some basic things about AI for the past 4 or 5 years. And one of the things that I've realized by making videos, trying to teach people about these things is that not everyone has the kind of basic understanding that I think a lot of academics, researchers, scientists assume that they do. So one thing that I would charge you with is go explain ChatGPT to your grandmother or like that friend who keeps posting AI generated weird stuff on Facebook. Another thing that I've been doing, in case you are interested, is for the past few years, I've been maintaining this gigantic spreadsheet of AI ethics and policy news. I don't have a specific tab in here for data, but it appears in a lot of different kinds of places. And there is a tab on IP and one on privacy that has a lot of like sort of current event stuff that's been happening in this space. So I will leave you with this final point on this sort of, the data ethics, the research ethics kind of point here. I think one of the challenges underlying all of this is that a lot of people think of, data as just data. Like once tweets are in a spreadsheet, they're data. Once you're scraping Instagram posts, they're just data. These are created by people. It might not be human subjects research under the definition of the common rule in the United States. But when data content is created by people, how that use impacts people, I think is really important and should be a consideration in how we're making decisions. So I will leave you with that. And wow, my timing was impeccable. And I'm really excited to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's super interesting. And we had a very lively discussion going in the chat. I've been
See
keeping
all
my
the
eye
little
on it.
emojis. That was very
There's a
nice.
lot of, yeah. So you got a taste of it with the emojis. So I am gonna go into we have some Q&A, some questions that have been submitted to the Q&A. I'm gonna skip around in them a bit. There's a few that are a bit like meatier, I would say, and a couple that are more maybe can be answered quickly. So I'm gonna skip around. Anyone in the chat, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. It's gonna be easier for me to keep my eye on it. And if anyone in the chat who was discussing a lot of topics feels like they want to frame that in a question, you can feel free to put it in the Q&A. So the first question I have is there a single go-to article that you would recommend to respond responsibly and clearly to that statement, the data is already public? So like, for example, if someone's working with a researcher who says they want to work with human data as though it's not sensitive.
Um, well, so this work that I talked about, the sort of public data stuff. Uh, that was largely supported by a significant National Science Foundation grant with myself and six other collaborators. The sort of title of our research project is pervasive data ethics for computational research. I will put a URL in the chat, but I'm pretty sure it's pervade.umd.edu, based with my collaborators at Maryland. So a lot of the papers that we have written over the years are archived there. I it sort of depends on the context. So, for example, the paper that Shamika and I wrote about Black Twitter, I think is actually a pretty good example of, of how this isn't just about being public. The Reddit research ethics paper, which is the most recent one out of this work, I also think is a pretty good example, in part because it has some ones of best practices. Though honestly, the most cited of all of this is the Twitter survey that I talked about at the beginning. That one's pretty commonly used in classrooms and stuff to teach about this topic. So that one might be a sort of basic start.
Great, thank you. And there's a kind of related question, but it's more on the side of what would you recommend based on knowing a lot about this topic? So the question is, many of us work with researchers and support them with their data. What would you recommend doing when a researcher comes to us for data management help and say, it's okay, it's public? And I suppose the implication here being that the librarian or the support person might not agree with that.
Um, well, I mean, it's great that they're coming to you, frankly. I just, saw someone just pointed out in the chat. So IRBs are unlikely to be helpful in this context. And actually, a couple of my collaborators published a paper specifically about where they talked to people at IRBs about how they think about internet data, and it was sort of but this kind of research pretty clearly does not fall under the common rule. So some people, if they go to their IRB, they might still be willing to help them, give an opinion, as people who know about ethics, but the IRBs are they are there for human subjects research, and this explicitly does not fall under the definition of human subjects research. And so they might not be able to help you at all. So actually going to a data librarian to ask about this stuff, I think is great. So I would say, gosh, those bullet points that I put at the end there, I really should turn that into a blog post or something. But these kinds of questions, right? Have you thought about if there's any potential harms of are of bringing more attention to this community, or like people being re-identified out of this data, are you going to be like quoting Reddit posts in your paper? And if so, like, do you have to? And do you think there's any potential harm of people, who read your paper, like finding that content again? I mean, I'll be honest, someone thinking about these issues at all is like miles above what a lot of people are doing. And sometimes if you have people stop and think about it, um, they will, like, they'll have thoughts. The other thing I'll say, I know this isn't particularly helpful at the moment, but myself and a subset of these collaborators, we're actually working on educational materials for this. We have another small NSF grant, sort of a follow-up, where we are, yeah, we're creating like modules for classes, online resources, and this kind of thing to help people with this, because, I mean, frankly, like graduate students especially don't really get enough training on research ethics at all, but especially not on this kind of research ethics.
Great. So we also have a question asking or stating first, I'm hearing so much in your talk about the potential benefits of applying community engaged research strategies to improve the use of publicly available person data, or publicly available in quotes. Are you aware of any researchers putting this strategy into place?
Um, yes. So there are some examples in the Reddit ethics paper of like people, going through moderators as gatekeepers, that sort of thing, like asking permission or how can we best do that. One of my collaborators, Sarah Gilbert at Cornell, has done a lot of really thoughtful work about working with Reddit communities specifically. So I do think there are some ways to do that. But another thing is also just like, I mean, even just taking the time to understand the community can really go a long way, I think. But sometimes it means collaborating with people in that community potentially as well.
Okay, I have a comment here. Fantastic talk. Thank you. What's your perspective on how, if ethical considerations can be systematized and turned into policy and research? Ideally, there would be some policy framework to prevent a researcher from publishing thousands of OkCupid profiles. At the same time, I don't have a lot of faith in IRBs or university legal counsels to be productive actors in this space.
I will, so I know policy is at a lot of different levels. There is some actually discussion in the federal government right now around some of these issues because of potential regulation around like researcher access to data. I haven't been super involved in these conversations, but some of my collaborators I know, have talked to some folks who've been working on drafting, all of this stuff moves very slowly. Who knows if any of it would happen? But there has been some discussion of this. This is a super tricky issue. In part because we don't have great, like, frankly, when it comes to research ethics in general, we don't have great mechanisms for dealing with this in academia. Very often the enforcement mechanism for research ethics violations is, oh no, someone might notice it when they're peer reviewing a paper and it gets rejected on those grounds. And this is true in my community as well. Like I'm on the research ethics committee for SIGCHI, which is in one of the groups under the ACM umbrella, like computer science. It's basically HCI researchers. And like peer reviewers reach out to us if they like need an ethics opinion. We don't tell them whether to accept a paper or not. We just give them an opinion. And it tends to be really messy because we don't have rules, and it would be hard to make rules, in part because all of this is so contextual. Something that I do sometimes point people to, and actually this might be useful for a lot of you in this context, the Association of Internet Researchers, AOIR, has a research ethics document that's actually pretty comprehensive. It's a lot of it is kind of based on questions, like here are some questions that you should be asking, these kinds of things. So that might be helpful. Um, and sometimes people will use those kinds of guidelines just as like enforcement mechanisms, but it's hard. Like, and I don't even know that I personally don't think that the solution here is that IRB scope needs to expand. Well, man, I don't know. That could be tricky too. I wish we had more forms of norm setting in our own communities. Some sub-communities in computer science has started sort of like ethics review, again, sort of post hoc. NORIPS, the big AI conference, for example, does that. I also like the thing that I beg of people, like, what can I do to help? Like, oh my God, write about ethics in your papers. Like ethical decisions should be in a methods section of a paper. So that's also something that I would like tell people if they can, when people come to me and ask like, for my opinion on things, one of the things I say is like, whatever decisions you're making, put it in the methods section of your paper. Like, this is how we learn from each other and form norms. I don't think that actually answered the question very well, but I think that's in part because I don't think there is a great answer what we should do with policy.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think it's super difficult. I have a question and then before changing subjects, because there's a couple questions that I'm gonna lump together that are on a different topic. But I'm wondering, so I'm based out of Quebec in Canada, where we have a new privacy law that would like somewhat prohibit a lot of that kind of reuse of what quote unquote public data. I know that the GDPR in Europe sort of prohibits to an extent where it doesn't conflict with terms of use of certain sites or whatever. And I'm wondering, maybe it's outside the scope of what you focus on and work on, but how do you see those different regulatory frameworks in different places that have stricter privacy laws? Do those sort of help in this situation? Do you see less of this kind of work coming out of those jurisdictions, or do you feel like in the academic sphere, there's a different set of norms that just sort of don't seem to like stop at the border?
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert on GDPR, and it's actually, but it's not super clear cut how GDPR applies in this particular context because there are some sort of like research carve outs. This came up recently. Like, I don't know if anyone heard about the newest controversy in this, or probably not the newest. This was like a couple months ago. But a researcher at Hugging Face released a Blue Sky data set for like machine learning researchers to use. And wow, were people on Blue Sky mad? I mean, not everyone, obviously, but a lot of people on Blue Sky were really mad about this and like really dragged him to the extent where he actually took the data set down, which I thought was probably the correct outcome because he did not intend it to sort of go that way. But a lot of people were like pointing to GDPR and their requirements around like ways to remove your data from various places. And so a lot of like public data sets will have like mechanisms to remove your data from that data set, which may make it GDPR compliant. But that kind of thing isn't really relevant for like, publishing a paper that used tweets. So I like, and I actually did a bunch of research because I was trying to respond to this Blue Sky thing in an informed way regarding GDPR, and I found myself confused. And other people were not able to sufficiently explain it to me. So I think we might still be in a bit of a gray area.
Okay, thank you for that. I have two questions I'm going to combine as our last question because then we'll be out of time. But thank you everyone for your questions so far and your comments. This has been a really wonderful discussion. So we have a couple that are similar, but one follows from what you just said. Does Blue Sky, are you aware if they have any policies about it? And this person says that they actually emailed their support email and didn't receive anything back about what policies they might have. And the second question is about YouTube, and someone mentioning that they know the current terms of service explicitly states that people need permission to use YouTube data, so the current ones, and they wanted to know if you're aware whether that's recent or not, or what the effects are.
So I actually don't know the answer to that regarding YouTube. You know, so there is a legal question about whether scraping data against terms of service is actually illegal or not. So I have written a paper about terms of service and data scraping. It was like an analysis of what a bunch of data scraping provisions are. One thing I argue in that paper is that I personally don't think that it's inherently unethical to break terms of service, because there are times you might break terms of service for entirely ethical reasons. But there was a lawsuit about data scraping on LinkedIn. And I think maybe there's the possibility this is still being appealed. I'm not sure what the current status of this lawsuit is, but at least a lower court said that it wasn't inherently illegal, like at least not, a violation of the CFAA or something, in order to scrape public data. And so it's a little bit questionable, actually, whether like a terms of service saying not to collect data is actually sort of legally valid if that data is public. For what that's worth. And some places like Blue Sky actually has an API. So like that was one of the other reactions to that, was like, why are you guys so upset about like Blue Sky sort of lets people do this. So it's pretty tricky, both legally and ethically.
Thank you so much. So there are a few more really good questions that I'd love to know the answer to, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I encourage our attendees to continue these discussions in Feed Loop if they'd like to. But I would like to say a big thank you to Dr. Fiesler and the audience for participating in this session, and we will see you at our next session because we have scheduled this conference very creatively. So we still have one more concurrent session after this talk. Right now, there is a 15-minute break. Although this is our final keynote, we do have, again, 2 final concurrent sessions starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So if you would like to attend sessions 7A or 7B, please check for the correct Zoom link, which you can find in the Feed Loop Sessions tab. I've gotten conflicting information about which link goes where, so I would just encourage everyone to go ahead and check. And thank you again to our speaker and our attendees, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you for having me.